Okay. So right here, and what is, okay, this is from texas.public.law. So this is not the official site for the state of Texas. What it is a site that, it's like my second resource. Let's put it this way. If I'm looking for Texas legal codes, this is the second website that I look at, and I usually try to cross reference it with the actual code for the state. But I'm going to say this now. I'm going to reference this now, and then I'm going to compare it with my spreadsheet. I have these spreadsheets that I've been making that I made made in 2017. This was part of my initial. These would have been the cases, the laws, and the context for consideration of my allegations of the criminal enterprise, specifically regarding that operationalization under the command of Executive Order 13707 regarding using behavioral science insights to better serve the American people led to processes whereby people were engaged without their informed consent in processes of human subject experimentation. And then there were attendant problems up to and including, but specifically connected to distribution or patterns of distribution that were involved in connection with dangerous drugs. And I had requested consideration of psychotropics as a dangerous drug in regards to determinations regarding how habituation to patterns of behavior can be a part of aiding and abetting a criminal conspiracy. This is part of the argument that I made. And my specific concern in this case was that the processes of intentionally undermining what were known to be the official policies regarding access to prescription medications, including and especially psychotropic medications, whose ingestion is specifically aimed to alter brain chemistry in efforts to moderate people's or modify people's behavior and habituate them to certain patterns of behavior, that engaging people knowingly and willingly in illegal processes regarding acquisition and then compelling them to uncompensated services is, which technically qualifies as a form of trafficking, in the course of distributing economic factors associated with the illegal acquisition, also constituted a form of illegal distribution. And then that was specifically connected to an understanding of the proliferation of the criminal enterprise attendant with the other crimes that one was either enticed or extorted into cooperation with, which could also include further proliferation or further distribution of the illicitly acquired dangerous drugs. And that by normalizing and habituating people to these illegal patterns of acquisition with the intent for distribution, that people would be inured into and habituated to engaging in illegal activity and would then be made more susceptible to cooperation with other kinds of illegal activity, up to and including potentially acquiring and distributing things that were already identified and accepted as dangerous drugs, i.e., things like methamphetamine or cocaine, and or at least in consideration at the time frame, marijuana. And the actual specific charges would have involved the way that I was retaliated against after witnessing other people in the shelter be retaliated against in, by the way, in a completely racialized paradigm. For refusing to engage in illegal acquisition and then distribution of marijuana. Now, in 2017, marijuana was not legal. And at least in Texas, the understanding of marijuana and access to marijuana was still understood to be a crime, including a crime that could potentially have serious implications. Now we are in a different matter, but at the time, having bared witness to marijuana and then the relationship around marijuana, and then seeing how the situation connected to marijuana was connected also in the same sort of pattern, including a pattern of knowingly and willingly violated what was the explicit policy, including policies that were required by the federal government in order for one to be eligible to receive the sort of funding that they were receiving and that they alleged to have justified receiving based upon what they were providing, which included compliance with policies. that they were willingly and knowingly not only violating the policies, but they were attempting to habituate people to understanding how to violate policy based upon a particular kind of behavioral expectation associated with not only the racialization of the scenario, but also with what was determined without verification to be required in order for them to get other access to resources that were known to be legal and that they were actually legally required to provide. And so, in that situation was also the understanding that as I was studying the technologies and was getting more confirmation on things that I already understood were happening, especially in connection with the designation of each individual room that the families were staying in as indicated as an asset of a specific company involved with the gas and oil sector, with the exception of two rooms that were memorials, as I put to the notes, were in memorial to, not in memorial of, but in no, an appreciation to. And this was the thing that was disturbing, was the specifics of the wording. It didn't say in appreciation of. It said in appreciation to. And there were two rooms that were indicated, that were identified in that manner, and the rest of the rooms had the name of a company. And one of them was at least one of them was Dow Chemical Company, and then there was another one that had Dow in it, but it was a different name of Dow. And all of the companies were either directly or otherwise associated with the gas and oil sector. So even without understanding at that time who was on the board of directors, but already knowing that members of the board of directors are fiduciarily responsible for a nonprofit organization and take on that responsibility when they agree to serve on the board of directors, which also means that they are responsible for the implications of criminal activity occurring at the organization on whose board they serve. You know, I already knew this from my personal experience and my past history as being involved with a nonprofit organization. So understanding that each room was identified by a nameplate on the outside of the door. You know, and the ironic thing is, if I'm not mistaken, that it was on the outside of the door on the either the left or the right side, right outside the door frame on either the left or the right side, and it had a number of the room and it had a name of the company on the actual nameplate. And understanding that these were companies that would have been involved with the gas and oil sector, then it became even more alarming that they had a major radio tower on site on the actual property of the shelter that I did not believe. I didn't have a measuring tape, but I marked it off by a pace. And it was under 200 meters from the door of the daycare center, and it was under 150 meters from the closest edge to the park where the children would play outside as part of the activities of the daycare center. And I believed, especially as I started to engage with other parents and talk to them, and as I started to read through some of the course materials for the course I was about to take, that it was confirming that this was not an appropriate thing anyhow. But more than that, my concern was that they were literally testing manipulation and augmentation of radio frequency in connection with the surveillance they had in the public areas, and then doing some sort of experimentation regarding the designations of individual families as assets of those companies. And that this was the kind of situation that was being authorized under that executive order. And so the attempts to engage with staff at the shelter were considered accordingly. Then, after I was kidnapped and refused to have any acknowledgement for the actual purposes for which I went to the neuropsychiatric center, which was because I had what I understood to be evidence, and I had reports that I needed to turn into somebody. But by the way, local police were not suited for these kinds of reports. But had I gone there and been able to get assistance with filing a report on witnessing child abuse and witnessing fraud involving an organization that claimed to have funding from a federal agency, which it did. It stated that it was a fine. The plaque in the lobby stated that it was provided with support from the state under the the VAWA, the Victims of Violence Act. provided by the state, and then it listed that it was receiving support from the Health and Human Services and HUD. I believe it said HUD as well, but it definitely said both the Texas Health and Human Services and the Health and Human Services on the plaque in the front lobby of the organ of the actual site that you would, and you had to go through that lobby in order to get to the room where you were discussing the paperwork around and signing the paperwork around your intake. That because of this, that if I'd been able to get in touch with somebody that was a mandated reporter of child abuse and fraud, as people who are involved with mental health care are, as physicians and as nurse practitioners and as social workers, in terms of people that provide treatment, including treatment concerning any sort of allegations or any sort of concerns regarding mental health, they are mandated reporters of child abuse. And they refused to acknowledge that I was there to report child abuse. And they refused to acknowledge that I had information and evidence with me at that time regarding the fraud that I had witnessed. And then they refused to engage in what was the explicit policy, including in the paperwork they gave me, that they were legally required to engage in order for me to even be admitted there for alleged treatment. So that's why it is, by the letter of the law, technically and legally, kidnapping, and there was nothing legitimate about it from a medical perspective. I.e., if you're actually a practitioner of medicine or you're actually a health practitioner, you are required by law to also understand your role as a mandated reporter of child abuse. They refuse to even acknowledge that. And so the other things that I was querying about, do you understand what the Nuremberg Code is? Now, if there's some disputation about the Nuremberg Code in consideration of it being legally binding as a law, my understanding is it is referenced in at least two cases that made it to the Supreme Court. There's a specific case it was referenced in regarding considerations of matters concerning the treatment of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay that was within the last 20 years has been presented to the Supreme Court since the onset of September 11th and the responses to the September 11th terrorist attack. And while it specifically has not been attempted for argumentation as a legally binding standard, the considerations of what it entails and the expectations of the kind of conduct that one is to expect from people involved in certain situations concerning processes of human subject experimentation has actually been addressed as a matter of law, including at the level of the Supreme Court. And then there is the matter of Executive Order 13707, which brings up, especially in the context of healthcare treatment, specific elements of the HIPAA regarding patient confidentiality, but also informed consent, which was something that I personally had to review as part of my job in the compliance department, the San Francisco Department of Public Health, in the fall of 2013 when they were making upgrades to HIPAA. Now, I believe that what is happening is that some people are attempting to justify a particular element of HIPAA regarding allowance for maintaining a certain level of confidentiality or auspices of confidentiality under the rubric of somehow providing for operational cost of the facility. But the questions of operational cost of the facility do not negate and permit for a violation of patient protections. And if there is an abuse of an attempt to invoke Section E of the particular elements of the Health Information Portability and Protection Act, in order to justify that for the cost effectiveness in maintaining that facility, it is justified to violate the other legal requirements concerning patient protections, then this is a violation of not only the explicit rules of HIPAA, but I contend is also potentially evidentiary of other attempts to undermine rights to due process by allowing for people to be misdiagnosed and mischaracterized because their refusal to engage people in processes of obtaining their informed consent, especially around issues concerning mental health treatment or mental health diagnosis, are actually one of the processes within which one must engage in order to actually substantiate they're providing that kind of medical service. That could come up with all kinds of questions, including questions concerning whether or not they are fraudulently billing for healthcare services that are not technically healthcare services. And if they're trying to do that in order to justify misrepresenting the terms, being able to maintain or provide in connection with operational costs of the facilities, then they're actually committing fraud even amongst the even within the rubric of that which would justify them attempting to engage in an action to obscure or obstruct the implementation of the other aspects of HIPAA. But I have nobody's ever cited that Section E is what covers them from being able to violate the rest of HIPAA. And they are by law required to understand that that is a requirement of their job. So if they refuse to provide the role of a mandated reporter, which they're by law required to do, and if they refuse to actually apply HIPAA in regards to not only patients' protection regarding confidentiality of information, but also in terms of acquiring informed consent for treatment, and also assuring that the person demonstrates their cognizance that they understand what is meant by consent. If they refuse to do, they're not doing that job. They're doing something else. And so rather than engaging a process of trying to speculate on all the other things they could be doing besides their job, the point of the matter is they're not doing their job. And they're committing fraud in terms of representing themselves as being in performance of that job. And in the process of doing that, what are they actually doing to the people who are seeking medical treatment? If they are abusing the processes of medical treatment, especially when it comes to prescription of potentially dangerous drugs, including dangerous drugs that have the intent of altering brain chemistry in order to modify behavior so as to habituate people to patterns of behavior, then they have to be considered accordingly. And if you violate the law explicitly in regards to those manners, and if you identify and acknowledge a psychotropic as a form of dangerous drug, and you attempt to extort or you attempt to defraud people through fear of and extort them through fear of economic harm into cooperating with illegal activity in order to acquire and then distribute dangerous drugs by the letter of the law, you are engaged in a criminal drug enterprise. It should be very simple on that level. But then the question becomes one of, especially after I saw these elements, these things. Now, with other things that I was investigating, because especially I was training to engage in processes of industrial technologies related to industrial inspection of industrial materials. And also because as part of that training, one of the things we were exposed to is what those technologies could be used for. And we were informed while we were in class, these are technologies that can be used for law enforcement, and these are technologies that can be used in a variety of sectors, including the aerospace sector and including defense sector. And so you are informed of this formally as part of your training in those techniques. That doesn't necessarily mean de facto that's what's going to happen. But when your instructor tells you that he was previously employed as an inspector at a nuclear power plant, and that the techniques you're studying that he is trained to be able to provide training in are potentially the kinds of techniques that you would be required to learn and apply and demonstrate proficiency in order to qualify as a inspector at a nuclear power plant, then things like policy, and especially when you are intentionally sabotaged before you go to school to study those techniques and those specific kinds of curriculum, and especially when, because you refuse to engage in illegal acquisition of and illegal distribution of dangerous drugs, you're denied indoor living arrangements, you're denied transportation, you're denied food, and you're denied access to hygiene. This calls into question, well, what were they really trying to get me to agree to do, knowing that they were already violating the explicit policies connected to what they said they were doing as part of their job? So this is why after that the concerns came up the way they did, and I decided what was important was to officially be on the record, and if I could not get an attorney to represent me, I had a right to represent myself pro se, and I was not going to relent on that, especially if every other option I had for survival involved trying to extort me into agreeing to cooperate with illegal activity. Every other option, including going to the shelter I was assigned to after I was allowed to leave the kidnapping scenario. Even when I went there, within 4 days of being there on site, they were attempting to compel me to agree to engage in activities I knew were illegal. Hence, I had to go back on the street. This pattern had been replicating over and over again the entire time, and had been part of what had been going on even before I got to Texas. But it definitely escalated in terms of the manner in which the coercion escalated in Texas. And when I was in Chicago, I tried to apply. I tried to go through the grievance process. I tried to be apply understanding that I might have qualified. That I believed I qualified as a whistleblower because of my former employment with the Health and Human Services, affiliated through the Department of Public Health, as well as the work that I necessarily was involved with in connection with policies set by the CDC, especially around emergency preparedness and prevention. That while I personally wasn't literally a worker for the Health and Human Services, that the Department of Public Health got got provided for its funding in part through appropriations to the Health and Human Services. And so, if there was a specific question about qualification as an explicit whistleblower, then that would have been an appropriate thing to bring up as part of the consideration of how it would be pursued. But to completely deny me any access to any participation in the grievance process, even as a so called consumer or even as a recipient of services, is part of what had escalated it once I was transported out of state to Texas, and then it escalated in Texas in terms of the kind of extortion and coercion that it was attempting to engage me in, and also what I was witness it to occurring to other people. Every other person I was in these shelters with was subjected to something comparable. And, when I was at the Bridge Over Troubled Waters, the women I was in that shelter with were women that not only demonstrated to me, and I believed that they actually were honest. I don't think they made a story up. They didn't, as far as I know, make up a backstory in order to try to create a scenario. It was almost as if somebody selected us with our back history to be there together as part of specific kind of social engineering, as if they wanted to recruit a cell or they wanted to recruit a clandestine operational unit, but they did not acquire anything close to what would have been verification of our consent. And we were there because we were fleeing violence, including threats, if not actual efforts to engage us in fatal violence. This is not appropriate under any circumstances. There's nothing legitimate about what they were doing. So the question becomes, well, what are they actually doing if they're not doing something legitimate? What is the actual illegal activity in which they're engaged? And so this is why now, this time frame later, one of the things I found was these laws that were in the Texas Health and Human Services Code, specifically concerning telemedicine, telehealth, and telemonitoring. Now, I was not familiar with what telemedicine or telehealth was. I had never heard of it. This is not something I'd even been apprised of when I worked in San Francisco. If this was on some other level or somebody else had an interest in providing those kinds of services, this was not something I was ever exposed to as an option in San Francisco. And specifically regarding the verification, especially for instance, if you're talking about mental health, somebody being able to go through what they need to go through in order to transport themselves or get transportation to the doctor's visit on site at the doctor's office or at the clinic is actually part of the assessment of your mental health status or your mental stability, and may be a determinant if as to whether or not you might need some other kind of support. And so to me, even structurally, or even from a perspective of what I understood was supposed to be part of the clinical health treatment, it didn't make sense to expect that somehow being able to have a therapy session over telephone or via computer in your own home was a legitimate option. This is not something that I had ever encountered. And when I was in the shelter, or when I was in the neuropsychiatric center, they never brought up telemedicine. The first time I heard about telemedicine is that they had a sign on a door. And I on the way into the West Oaks Hospital, and the sign on the door said telemedicine services provided here. And I was like, well, what is that? I had never heard of it, but this was on the way into what should have been the intake at West Oaks Hospital. Um, and the entire time I was there, they never said anything about telemedicine, but they also did not go through what they were legally required to go through in terms of disclosing any of the surveillance or disclosing the other things that they were required to under the Texas Patients Bill of Health, the Bill of Rights. So after getting out, and I was doing the research to see if there was something specific in the Health and Human Services Code that may explain what was happening, I came across this information. Specifically, the ones that I was concerned about at the time were the Women's Health Advisory Committee. And I was specifically concerned about the Women's Health Advisory Committee because on my first day at the Neuropsychiatric Center, they had a list of phone numbers. And one of them said that it was, I think it was called, not the Women's Center, but the Women's Place or the Women's Circle. It had a name, it was the Women's, it was like either Center or Circle or Place. And it was identified as being in Houston, and so you could call. So I called that number after calling my caseworker, and I got a voicemail that said it was for something called Acumen Consulting. And so I hung up. I thought maybe I misdialed, I dialed the wrong number. So I called the number again. And then I didn't know what Acumen Consulting was. But my consideration was, well, are they doing some sort of services where they're like a third party provider in connection with the Women's Center? So I left them a message on their voicemail. I said, I am here. They violated the policy. You are being listed as the phone number for this particular agency. If you work with them, relay this message. Otherwise, know that this is here. I in no way gave them any consent to engage me in their consulting services, and I did not know who they were. But then when I got into the other room, the south side room, which had the darker lighting, they had a different list of numbers on the wall. And one of them said that it was for the Harris County Department of Health. And when I called that, I got a voice message. And the voice message said, "Dial 1 if you want a rebate." And I said, what does that mean? I want a rebate. I'm trying to call the Department of Public Health, the Harris County Public Health Department, the line that had been identified, and they dial 1 if you want a rebate. So I hung up the phone. I didn't do that. And then I called again. They gave the same message, and I'm like, dial rebate for what? So after that, then I called the caseworker and I gave her the number and I told her what was happening. I said, keep this information as evidence because I was able to get through to the caseworker who worked at the bridge over troubled waters a couple of times. So I gave her both of those messages. But both times they had numbers that were listed that didn't have the actual direct connection that it said it had. And I was concerned. As soon as I heard the one about the rebate, I was absolutely certain that it was a psyop. Whatever had happened on the other side regarding the television and the way that staff behaved was one thing. But as soon as you get a voicemail, it says dial 1 if you want a rebate. Then I'm like, okay, this is a psyop. I didn't identify it specifically as a psyop, but I started thinking about it as if we were being, that it was a sort of political internment. And this was reinforced because then they had that CNN message. There was a CNN message on the television that said that there had been a number of Russian activists who had been detained. They had the news on at times. They had these runners going on with the news, which, to be honest with you, didn't make much sense to me. The way that they had the TV support. The lobby had game shows. They had CNN, which was an official television station presenting live news in one room. But then in the back room, it was like a sort of automated news. They just had these feeds that came up with some sort of news feed service was providing these briefs and this information in that particular room. And so it was like they were sending out these triggers. They were sending out these cues to see which one you would pick up on. And so then the third number they had was for a legal service provider that happened to have the same name as the legal service provider, presumably providing legal services at the shelter, even though the women I talked to either had outside counsel from some other manner or were trying to represent themselves pro se in their proceedings. But they were identified as being on site to provide legal counsel at certain times during the months while I would have been there. And so I called them and I went through at least 3 different stages of trying to actually speak to somebody that could potentially have provided legal assistance and was denied every time. And every time it was, again, one of these, well, I can't help you, I'm going to divert you. And then you get a voicemail, you leave a message on the voicemail, they never call back. So then I saw this here, and it's, the things that were, so that was about the Women's Advisory Committee, but then there was a situation where they're talking about this one regarding the database um, software. Where's this at? So the ones that I have here are the developed the Department of Information Resources automation standards for computer systems. That's what it says. This code, planning and delivery of health and human services data sharing, developed with the Department of Information Resources automation standards for computer systems. Then the next one, at the request of a governmental entity identified under section, and then it says the number, assist that entity in implementing a coordinated plan that may include co-location of service. And this was the thing that was concerned to me. This concept of co-location of service. What does that mean? Because it would appear that what was happening is that people were on site, but then there was something happening somewhere else. And whatever was happening somewhere else was influencing or determining what was being attempted for a response or a trigger where you were. And considering that the other woman who had been the caseworker in this completely racialized pattern had brought up this question of have you ever heard of the impact of the observer in a quantum experiment? I was like, I know what you're saying, and it's not appropriate for you to do that. And that's why I believe they escalated and then they started engaging in the way they did. It was as if they were trying to get me to agree to understand it as a proxy, and that I was supposed to be proxying for somebody. And this had been happening ever since I was in Chicago, where people would try to treat me like I was somebody else. And the implication was that I was supposed to pretend that I was somebody else, and they were going to pretend they were somebody else. And then we were going to work a scenario like they were somebody and I was somebody, while they were in explicit violation of the policies and the rules they were supposed to be applying in the literal job that they had, which literally was controlling access to resources, including healthcare and including food and including housing, which was not appropriate and is illegal. So this concept of the plan that may include co-location of services later also became a concern, because at another point there was information I obtained specific to an understanding of having a representative, that people that are alleged to have some sort of mental incapacity can get somebody to provide a representation for them. And this also gets into an understanding of a coordinated plan for treatment of somebody alleged to have a mental disability that can also involve intercession through a risk representative. As if you've got somebody risk brokering your treatment options and the full plan associated with you being able to access resources, which is not acceptable, right? Especially if it's understood in an evaluation of, well, what are the implications of co-location of services, especially if they refuse to obtain your informed consent and demonstrate that they have done what they needed to do to be legally uh, eligible to perform the other services associated with their job based upon them applying the requirements necessary for their job. So even if it is your job to ascertain what the elements of a comprehensive plan for treatment are, and that comprehensive plan for treatment can also involve either being in the role of or intercessing in the role with somebody in the role of a risk representative, and or implementing that plan in consideration of co-location of services, you need to demonstrate that you're doing what you're legally required to do as part of your job to be eligible to do those things. And at no point did anybody demonstrate that they had even the most basic understanding of the most basic requirements of their job, such as application of HIPAA and or application of the Texas Patient's Bill of Rights, and making sure to acquire informed consent, as well as acknowledge that if, for instance, at the Bridge Over Troubled Water, if they provide you with paperwork and they tell you to go through the agreement, they need to make sure that you understand what you're agreeing to. And if they give you an agreement and it says right there on the agreement that one does not have to agree to participate in any sort of research project in order to receive services, and then you indicate that you're cognizant of what that means and that you have no desire to participate in any sort of research projects, and you understand you are not under any legal obligation to, and they have no legal right to try to require you to, well, then after that, every single staff member you intercess with and everybody else that you engage with that is connected to that intake or is able to justify access to you as a resource based upon that intake also has to acknowledge you were never obligated and they had no legal right to require you to participate in any sort of research, including research connected to behavioral sciences when it came to program administration or trying to determine efficiency in program administration. As this is the whole point. And whatever the justification is for not explicitly doing your job and attempting to compel people to demonstrate that they will engage in illegal activity before you give them access to things you're legally required to give them, what's the point? Well, then, now we're a couple years down the road. What we've seen is things that were basic rights for people and things that the people that it were in the positions to have the role of providing people with what they needed to get access to resources were consistently attempting to habituate people to violating the law and to shirking policy in order to do things that they knew were either in violation of policy or even outright illegal. And now we have a situation where literally the legislator of Texas has passed laws that are blatantly and flagrantly unconstitutional. The governor signed laws that are blatantly and flagrantly unconstitutional. And then they try to put off onto the people of Texas that they have approved through referendum changes to the Constitution that are blatantly unconstitutional and are illegal and should never have been allowed to make it to the ballot if the people who were in the positions that they say that they were qualified to be in had done their job in assuring that things that were blatantly and flagrantly unconstitutional were not fraudulently characterized as being voter approved. Because they're not. Technically, so this is part of what has been. So in that situation, when you talk about, well, co-location of services, well, how many co-locations? How many co's do you have? Because then, if you start talking about various kinds of programs, including some programs that may not be the kinds of things people are immediately apprised of, or that may be a part of particular national security paradigms that understand that there are different layers to communication, including potentially compressed bandwidths that have multiple frequencies that are broadcasting different levels or different kinds of information concurrently. And once they're able to move, are able to actually be decompressed and then appropriately applied. And instead, what you have is people that are intentionally, explicitly sabotaging their own situation with an anticipation that somebody else is going to assist them in up leveraging the risk they're engaged in their milieu in order to try to access some advantage that comes with delivery of having been engaged in and engaging in that risk at another level that will then at some point later end up materializing in their literal lives and in their literal milieu. But if you're not doing what you need to in your explicit realm and your explicit level to be able to do what you need to do, especially in providing for other people, then how does that impact any other location with which you might be coordinated? My understanding is that they knew that, and the intent was to sabotage the location they were in order to extort not only the people they were in network with literally, but to extort people at other levels, in other places with which they were co-located into seeding or into allowing for resources that were accessible there to come to them. And this is what I've been, unfortunately, as the years have gone on, this is the only thing that seems to make sense from any sort of operational justification. I mean, regardless of whether who we're talking about, these practices of intentionally and willfully misapplying standards that are necessary to qualify for the actual role that you're in, especially insofar as it has to do with access to resources. And we're at the most basic level. We're talking about housing. We're talking about food. We're talking about a shower. I can't get past those levels. I can't get past those levels because I understand I am supposed to be, or I have the capacity to engage in certain levels where there might be significant risk involved. And the understanding is that there were people that know, just like when I was in that shelter, the women I was in that shelter with were the kind of women that were qualified and had past experiences of being involved in sectors that would have taken on significant risk of a certain kind and would need to demonstrate a certain kind of competence. But they had been disassociated from even their living situation after a threat of physical violence, if not an actual delivery of physical violence. And these shelters were trying to coerce them into agreeing to compromise what would have been the necessary standards they would have applied in those particular areas they were qualified to be a part of. For what? Well, how many of those women were able to actually return to the kind of person and the kind of capability and the kind of life that they had prior to going to that shelter? What I understood was happening is we were being reprogrammed. They wanted to recharacterize us. By entering us into the shelter, they got a composite and a history of our lives. They were creating a product based on our actual human capital. And then we were supposed to go to some sort of alleged medical treatment so that it could be farmed out through the medical sector as some product. And I haven't gotten to that stage where I'm the end user of the product that ends up being created from the expropriated human capital of people that have been farmed into the medical machine. I haven't been in that situation yet, right? I believe the anticipation is, well, at some point, if you do what you need to do to demonstrate your loyalty in this manner, then we'll allow for you to get into these areas. And even if you're not literally personally qualified, once you're there, if you make the commitment, you'll be put into a position where you can acquire a product that gives you a profile. And then when you engage in the profile, you'll be able to assimilate various kinds of processes that have been automated. And if you just cooperate with the cues that you're given, then you'll be able to function within that automated environment. But again, here we are at the most basic level of informed consent. And not only informed consent, but informed consent based on an acknowledgement of understanding that there is a certain kind of peril or there's a certain kind of responsibility you're taking on in this role. And so you have to be consistent. You have to be competent. You have to be engaged in a process that's safe, and if not, and at least honest. Because the other side is that you also have to be able to know what's going on in your environment. So if there's a disruption, or if there's a peril, or if there's something that's out of place, you can identify it as such, so you can communicate it to someone, including someone who might have more skills or expertise than you do. So you could say, I can't do this right now. I don't know how to do this, or I can't do this because I don't feel confident or I don't feel comfortable, rather than consistently trying to undermine somebody into just accepting, don't worry about it. Oh, we don't really have the money for it. And nobody knows what that is. Just do what you're supposed to do. Well, that's not that. And you do that to somebody enough, and then you start saying, well, I mean, your child is yelling. We're really going to need for you to settle her down, and we're not going to be able to keep you here. Well, I have nowhere else to go. Well, I mean, we can't keep you here. We have so many women that have a need. And the thing is, well, you have your job is to make sure that the women who are here end up getting what they need. Or do you have a way to justify the fact that you need to put that child on medication before you justify whatever it was that allows you to work in an environment that is dangerous for you because you're in proximity to a radio tower that is not within the legally required distance from a daycare center? And the thing is as a consumer, and so this is where the other thing gets into, where the other situation gets into, which is this concept, well, who's qualified to do what? Because if I'm a woman that's been exposed to fatal violence and I need to go to a shelter for services, it's not supposed to be my job to make the workplace better for the woman who's getting paid to provide me with services. And if I say, you know what, I used to be involved in something wherein I would have been your colleague in a professional level, maybe in a different department, but I would have understood some of the stress you're dealing with and some of the requirements for your job. By the way, it's not legal for these things to be happening in your workplace. The last thing you are supposed to be allowed to do is tell me I got to go get illegal drugs if I want to stay inside. And at that point, we get into a situation of, well, if you cannot do your job without getting illegal drugs to stay inside, you shouldn't have your job. And the problem isn't with me. The problem is with you and everybody else that has that job. And this has been what has been happening ever since. So then the question becomes, well, how many people are in their automated program service plan so that we get to this situation here? Provide for reimbursement of multiple providers of different services who participate in a single telemedicine medical services and telehealth services session for a child with special healthcare needs. So your job is to get those kids on drugs, because then you get multiple service providers in your network to use that one kid as part of a telehealth session you don't disclose, and then you get reimbursed. When do you get reimbursed? What are you putting in to the pot that you expect to get reimbursed as part of whatever the justification was for doing something other than your job? Are you networking? Are you engaged in a professional network? Do you see all of us women that come into that domestic violence shelter as a future service provider of telemedicine medical services? Is that why, regardless of what we did in our lives before, by the time we leave, we're all supposed to be ready to put on scrubs? Because that's what they did. Every woman that was there, regardless of what she was doing before, they kept trying to put into some sort of medical service program. Insurance biller or coder, maybe. But in-home healthcare, nursing assistant, there was one woman, she was supposed to be a secretary at a daycare center, even though she was a software developer. Why would you take women like us with the kind of skills and the caliber we have and then basically tell us by the time we leave, we have to be ready to accept that we're going to be put in scrubs as our uniform? That's what they did. Now where are we? Do you need me to say anything else? I mean, you wanted me to talk about healthcare, right? I mean, that's what this is all about. You want to see that I took some obligation somebody else set up to make me their medicine girl seriously. Well, I do. Where are we at now? Because we haven't even gotten to the lawyers, right? And that's the point. I'm never supposed to get to a lawyer. And the lawyers want it that way.